I'll see if my dexterity is good enough to manage these two things at the same time. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's nice to be back. Actually, my project was in collaboration with ANAFI. Glad it's still in business, despite of that. But so today, I'm going to provide you a little bit of an overview of what I think are a couple of key concepts related to breeding and diversity. I'm not going to be able to solve any of the issues that Martino pointed out, but perhaps I just want to point out a couple of things that I think are somewhat confusing. At least they were for me when I started working on this, and I think they're important points that we need to worry a little bit more about in terms of managing diversity. The other in the room, say, hey, not because I want to recognize people, but because I think it's important to recognize that selection is not here. It's embedded in the way we selection we actually want to and is the last point. First thing is not including every the rate of breeding here is year generation into a if you look at the breeder's equation, the L at the bottom got very small. The other thing that happened is perhaps a little bit less obvious is that the rate of inbreeding per generation should decrease under genomic selection simply because we're no longer bound by project testing. We have a much larger pool of individuals that can access the genotype, pretty much the entire population if you think about it. And so we are actually able to do a couple of things. Increase the genomic pool, and actually we're doing something very simple. We're actually better a discriminating relationship between individuals, so we're better at picking mendelian samples within families, right? So before we were saying two individuals are related to 0.5, now we know that we can discriminate between a 0.48 and 0.52. So all these things are happening at the same time. Okay, the good and the bad are happening at the same time under inbreeding, under genomic selection. So the result, the net result of all these things happening is that homozygosity is increasing a little bit faster than it was before under pedigree schemes. And here you have this. This is a little bit dated, but the results are the same. I'm not going to spend too much time here because Martino provided pretty much the same picture. As you can see, if you look at the increasing in the inbreeding, you will see a large increase in inbreeding after genomic selection. Perhaps Emmanuel will tell you a little bit more about that. Again, we need to go back to this idea of what inbreeding represents. Inbreeding, first of all, it's a very bad measure of inbreeding depression. And we're going to talk in a second about what inbreeding does really measure. And here I again apologize for patronizing you. This is straight from my class notes. Most of you already know these things, but I think it's important to recognize that inbreeding and inbreeding depression are two different things. So when we talk about inbreeding, and we go back to the classic definition of Krohn-Kimura, it's basically the probability of two random alleles at the same locus from two gametes which unites that are identical by the sex. So they're actually copies of the same ancestral allele. The consequences of inbreeding and identical by descent are in this little table here, where we introduce this genotypes, frequency, and genotypic value. And what I want you to point out is that this measure here, F, is what we're really interested in, is our inbreeding. What we're all worried about when we talk about inbreeding is this point here. The mean of an invert population will decrease by something that is a function of this second term of the equation here, which is a function of D and inbreeding, where D is nothing else than the dominant effect of an allele. So here you have this little table here, which tells you that the amount of inbreeding depression, so how much your mean of population decrease under inbreeding, is dependent on the effect of D, the dominance of that particular allele. With two extremes here, where you have D that is 0.5, this is at the increasing of F, your mean of the population goes down. But the important thing is, when D is 0, there is no inbreeding depression because there is no dominance. There are no that are actually going to be able to be expressed under genetic. So there are several theories about inbreeding and inbreeding depression. I'm not going to spend any time talking about this. But just say that for the most part, people believe that inbreeding depression is a function of many, many partial recessives that accumulates in the population, and under inbreeding are expressed in homozygous state, and actually therefore result in an increase in the reduction of the population. So far we have talked about inbreeding in terms of reduction of the mean. What happened in terms of variance? And actually this has a little bit less to do with managing of inbreeding and inbreeding depression, and has a lot to do more with managing okay, and I don't like to do complicated. So here is that the variance, the genetic variance under inbreeding, and for the sake of simplicity, let's just concentrate on some of these things here. So again, this is the additive variance, this is the dominance variance, this is the covariance between additive and dominance that is created by the fact that we have increased equilibrium in the population, and these last two terms are actually related to the heterozygosity itself. So when dominance variance is 0, the additive variance is actually all these elements here are 0. So the only genetic variance is the additive variance, which is actually increased. So under inbreeding, if there is no dominance, you have a larger variance than you have not under inbreeding. Now, this needs to be taken as a picture, because these stems from the fact that they're separate. variance, the way we conceive variance, is just a function of how we store our alleles. This is no different than when you have biparental lines, right? And biparental lines are actually completely invariant. So the variability in each specific line is 0. But when you cross them, you have 100% of the variability plus a few extra interesting things related to that percentage. Okay, so that's another important point that I want to drive home, is that variability and how we manage genetic variance is not only a function of the genetic architecture of the trait. It has much more to do on how we store our pool of genes in the total amount of the population that we have than in the genetic variance. Okay, so the next question, when we talk about the fact that a lot of these things are related to dominance effect, then the second question you need to ask yourself, okay, how much dominance there is in the population? And here you have a few of the many papers that have come out in the last few years. And just to quote a very old social media, you can always say it's complicated. We don't actually know how much variance there is in the population. And under the premises that we have this reduction in inbreeding on the population due to inbreeding depression due to dominance, and here you have the genetic trend in one side for the dairy population in the US and the inbreeding trend. It appears to me that there is no inbreeding depression whatsoever. Okay? Yeah, we all know there are a lot of experiments, there's a lot of results that show that there is dominance in the population. So what's the problem? The problem is that it's hard to quantify dominance with a series of genetics and statistical issues. But here comes the kicker. Because inbreeding per se is not a bad thing, we need to define a better method to identify the part of inbreeding that is actually detrimental to the population versus the part of inbreeding that is actually under functional selection because it's of interest. So if I can make a very simplified example here, on the left is how you treat inbreeding right now. This is how we expect, right? This is the level of inbreeding, this is the production of population, this is the decrease in the population. In reality, this depends not on the mean of the inbreeding, but depends on the genomic load of each individual. How many parts are accessible that are related each individual carries. So I can imagine easily 3 situations here with individuals that have the same level of inbreeding, but a completely different genomic load that suffer much less or much more inbreeding depression at the same inbreeding depression. So a lot of the research that we are doing is centered around these particular issues, okay? So ideally, if we were able to identify all these dominant variants that are partial deleterious, we could do something like Martino said. Go ahead and edit it. Unfortunately, and there are a few good simulations that show how that is wonderful if you can do it. Unfortunately, identifying partial recessive, it's much harder than identifying a little bit additive effects. Why? Well, the first thing, if you think about the linkage disequilibrium between a marker and a causal variance, the simplest thing that you can think is that the R square between the marker and the causal variance is basically the amount of information that we have to work to identify the particular allele. While for additive effects, this is proportional to the R square. For variance, for the dominance effects, it's actually proportional to the square of the square. You have a much lower power to identify these things. The other thing is that we always, when we think about these things, we think about this population, that this theory that has been derived under perfect idealized condition. Basically, all the partitioning of variance that we do is based on the Fisher model, where additive and dominance are independent. Okay, they are orthogonal. There is no equilibrium, there's no population admixture. Unfortunately, we all know that in real population, that's not the case. So additive and dominance are actually confounded with each other. Okay, there's a partial confounding between one or the other, which makes identifying additive and dominance very hard. And it's also partially explained why all the probability, all the population conditions trying to identify dominance variation in dairy, the signal is always small. Remember, it's not about the true effect, it's about how we store the information. Okay. Okay, and there is a third problem here that is related to actually the machinery that we use. Because to identify partial recessives that have a negative effect, we need to imply that there is directional dominance. And if we imply that there is directional dominance, that directional dominance is partially absorbed by the inbreeding coefficient that we actually include in the evaluation. So it's hard to tease these things apart. But as the number of individuals become larger, as we access sequence information, and we do all these things that we are supposed to do, and everyone told us to do for the last 20 years of our life, you can see that there is some dominance information that can be teased out. So it's a beating process, right? So once we identify dominance variant, we reduce the residual variance and become a little bit better at identifying the next one. So it's an iterative process, and over time we'll become better at identifying these things. And we could say, okay, we don't need to worry about it. Okay, we'll keep identifying the variance, and who cares about inbreeding? So do we still need inbreeding? The answer is yes, of course. We still, inbreeding is still a useful method for certain because it allows us to understand what the situation, what's the standing variation of our population. I won't spend too much time in telling you that there are many ways to measure inbreeding. They're all poor approximation of all these processes that I showed you before, but they're still useful. If you think about inbreeding as a shotgun measure, zygosity, these little attempts here are still using a shotgun measure, but perhaps taking a little bit better aim. Okay? So we're still using a rough measure of zygosity of the population, but we're trying to refine it a little bit. So we went to one extreme, identifying causal variance, dominance effect. We are going to the other extreme, which is that we don't want to know anything about the single link, just lump them all together in a single measure. Okay? So okay, so we know relationship. I told you that we're better able to sample the individual relationship with genomic versus pedigree. And here is the simple example. This is the expectation of the pedigree breeding, right? That's what we expect individuals to be related to. In this case, to full SIP. We know that with genomic information, we have a little bit more information to actually discriminate these individuals, which actually turns out to be useful, because if I have an individual that's a little bit more inbred to the mean of the population, I can discriminate a little bit better than before. So if I do some sort of pre-correction for inbreeding depression based on genomic or based on pedigree or based on nothing here, you can see that I discount, and in this case I have it for male and fat based on Holstein population. You can see that I can, if I correct for inbreeding depression based on genomic information, I discount it's pretty value. A little bit more conservative. There are a few caveats attached to that. There's always a caveat attached to everything I say. Okay, there's always a caveat attached to that. Genomic inbreeding tends to be a little bit more forgiving of identical by state and identical by descent, because we don't really track the gene flow of the alleles, just track the state of the homozygotic characteristics. So a lot of problems related to that, we're going to do. So if we look at inbreeding depression, and we look at the very bad measure of how much inbreeding depression we're taking off, one way to look at it is to look whether the ingredient that I correct for is more significant under one model or the other. And here I have the p-value for different traits here. Again, this is based on a small subset of Holstein population. If I correct inbreeding depression for the genomic information, is much more significant than if I do it for pedigree. What I'm saying is basically we're better able to track those partial recessives surprise anyone. So the other thing we can do, I just told you that inbreeding is not created all equal. Inbreeding needs to be somewhat created, and the easiest discrimination we can do is to actually put a temporal information on inbreeding. So inbreeding, as I said before, underlies two processes, right? The process that is related to the dominance of the figures and the one that is related to the actual inbreeding into selection. We can assume that inbreeding that is under selection is good, right? And an inbreeding that is not under selection is just carried out by the side, and then we have a large equilibrium. So the measures that we'll look at, which are called runs of homozygosity, which are nothing else than just short segments of the genome that are just a way to look back in the past. If I had inbreeding that happened many generations ago, natural selection or artificial selection have had their time to chip away the deleterious variation that was negative, that was found in the linkage equilibrium, that is due to the founder effect, the fact that we select individuals and we take whole chromosomes, not just little chunks of chromosomes. And then I have only these little pieces that are generated, or large pieces that are generated recently, that contain the deleterious variants that are enriched for deleterious variants. So if I manage those, I can constrain inbreeding a little bit less because I'm a little bit more liberal. I don't constrain the overall inbreeding of the genome. I constrain pieces of inbreeding throughout the genome. I'll go fast. Oh. No, that's okay. So the idea of ROH is just basically just introduce this temporal effect. Say, not so bad. Actually, probably have a positive, so as a positive effect. So I don't control it that effect. Short, large chunks of homozygosity, long chunks, and I forget for a second about the better than just using a pump. I just like it. So there is a lot of over the last 5 or 6 years, there's like hundreds of papers. Okay. I can see that if I do nothing, if I don't manage my population, it go up. And of course, you have to simulations and you always have to take everything. So the best we can achieve is actually by managing genomic selection, genomic inbreeding. Right? But remember, genomic inbreeding is sort of like a too big of a shock, right? We're not making differences between research and inbreeding, so we're trying to minimize everything. So actually, we learn the genetic selection that we have because we're penalizing inbreeding. The other two, long ROH and short ROH, do exactly what they are supposed to do. They minimize illicit inbreeding that has a higher chance to contain lethal recessive or sublethal recessive in this case, and still manage to do a decent job in controlling the rate of inbreeding. So the whole point of using those ROH measures is that, okay, a word on optimal contribution selection. Yeah. I'll keep going. There are many good theoretical applications to control inbreeding. The problem
problem is that the farmer makes the insemination, right? So it's the farmer who... Yeah, I'm chained.
Yeah, you cannot go farther than that.
Okay. So over the years, there have been a lot of work about how you can come up with the best solution to minimize inbreeding, optimize genetics. The problem is there is not a single entity like in pig breeding that makes the insemination decision. The farmer does. And it's really hard, especially in the United States, convince the farmer to take a sort of a socialist approach to the problem, right? So they're all good. None of them is truly applicable in reality. You can do a lot of things, and actually, to identify recessive mutation of large effect, like deleterious that are lethal, we're doing a pretty good job because of the nature of what we're doing, but also because there are a few ways in which you can actually manage them effectively in the population. The problem becomes when you're trying to estimate those little partial deleterious mutations that are not very easily identified. So I'm not going to go through these things. These things spread in the population exactly because they have small effect. So they're hitchhiked with the variance of positive effects, and they tend to accumulate alongside, and they're very hard to identify. And the way they work is that you might have 10 mutations that are deleterious and you're fine. You have 11 mutations that are deleterious and you're fine. At a certain point, you reach a hump, right? Which every new mutation will cause a decrease. Not because the mutation is particularly deleterious, but you have accumulated enough load to make it actually deleterious itself. There is also something that I'm not going to even touch, which is related to the challenge of an individual. How much environmental challenge an individual has will actually determine whether a variant is deleterious or not. Okay, so variants that are not deleterious under normal condition will be deleterious under challenging condition. Heat stress, perhaps is one of those. We might see some of these things in the future a little bit more. Okay. Part of the research we're doing is just trying to identify those deleterious mutations. I'm not going to go through some of these things because it's not particularly interesting for the purpose of this workshop here. But the idea is that if I can somehow identify some sort of inbreeding load rather than inbreeding per se, then I can create a matrix that is an inbreeding load matrix that actually penalizes those functional variants a little bit more. And again, I can do a better job at managing the genomic load rather than managing inbreeding by itself. And we have done some work in trying to identify those regions of reduced homozygosity that are related to functional variation. And you can see some of them overlap. And there is some work that has been published recently in a collaboration with the University of Guelph and Christine Bay. So if you're interested on how this works, you can look up the publication. And again, you can see the same exercise I did before, right? It's a poor indication of whether it's good or bad, but it's still an indication. My p-value for inbreeding depression using the ILM, the inbreeding load that I identified function, is much higher than if I would use the other one. And then you can think of ways to penalize inbreeding that are a little bit more refined than they are now, right? So you have your breeding value, and then you penalize your general inbreeding because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and you penalize the inbreeding, the functional inbreeding, and the lambda are just the coefficient that you can use. And you can think of different ways you can do it. You can think of ways in which you can put 100% of the weight on the general inbreeding and 0 on the functional inbreeding if you don't know anything about the functional inbreeding, or the other opposite in which you put all your emphasis on the functional inbreeding if you're lucky enough to having identified all the functional variants. Same idea here, just to show there are other ways that are akin to ROH that are more model-driven. They're very nice. They're appealing from the statistical point of view. I'm not going to talk about it. The only thing I want to show you is again this concept that inbreeding is a bad measure of the inbreeding load of an individual. Here I have 50, if I go this way, no, even worse. Here I have 50 random Holstein cows, for which I calculated the age of inbreeding, of their inbreeding coefficient. And you can see, so you can think of this as the number of generations ago that inbreeding happened, based on genomic information, 2 generations ago from to 500 generations ago. So old inbreeding. And you can see that each individual is a hodgepodge of all these things, right? And you remember from what I said before, these 2 individuals might have more or less the same inbreeding level, but their composition of their inbreeding genomic load might be completely different. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what the research we're doing is trying to get at. Can we actually differentiate between these 2 things? And actually, it turns out, to see if I have another one, it actually turns out that if you divide recent and old inbreeding and you calculate inbreeding depression based on this old and recent inbreeding, you can see that actually, in this case, you have it for Canadian Holstein again. This is again the work of Bayote. You can see that old inbreeding, based on any measure that you have, is much more detrimental for phenotypic means of the population than it is that young inbreeding, that old inbreeding is. Okay, so again, in some cases, and as you would expect, old inbreeding actually has positive effect. Why? Because technically those are the variants that are under selection because we are selecting for this information. And of course, you can do this also in other livestock species, and Emmanuel is here and he can talk to you about how that is the same also in beef cattle. So it's very simple, okay? In a sense, it's a very dumb way to approach the problem. We can go from one end of the spectrum and say, if we identify all the dominance variants, we can actually include each of them in an index with its own weight, or you can calculate a breeding value that automatically account for all of this. And technically, we should be able to eliminate inbreeding depression without actually having to worry too much about the measure of inbreeding per se. We're not there, and it will be a while before we get there. The other end of the spectrum is we use inbreeding as we have always used it. We calculate a lump sum of inbreeding, we stick it into it, and see what happens. In the meantime, as a step, as a gap stop measure, you can try to differentiate inbreeding based on the age of inbreeding, and you can do perhaps a better job here. Last thing on managing diversity. How much time do I have? I don't want to kill anyone. I can stop here, or I can give you I'll stop here. I still have time? Okay. I can stop. So I can give you the 2 largest fears of anyone who's working with livestock population. We all work with standing variation. It means that we are not in an idealized population, which is an Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, so we don't have to worry about anything, right? So we have 2 things. The first thing is on the left. The second thing is on the right. The first thing is inbreeding depression and losing production because of dominance. And the second one is exhausting genetic variability, okay? We talked a lot about this first one because that's easy, okay? I told you about the genetic load. I told you the inbreeding load. I didn't tell you too much about selection and purging, and I didn't tell you about the mutation load again, but again, the concept is the same. So the fear here, we're all gonna die because we're all gonna be sick, okay? We're all gonna get some sort of mutation that's eventually gonna kill us on the long run. The second issue is the one that has perhaps the largest implication over long term, but it's also much more complicated. Is the selection limits. How much genetic variability can we still tap on before we run out of it, right? And if we keep inbreeding population, we're not gonna have enough information to do selection. And that again, it's even more complicated because it depends on 2 things. It depends on the genetic architecture that we use, and it depends on the operational models that we use. Again, we tend to think that the statistical model that we use represents the reality 100%, but in reality they do not. They're just mathematical approximations that work well because they're computationally very friendly. Okay, we talked about these things, but in the short term, managing homozygosity will become still a process in which we control the population and who mates who. okay? Genetic architecture, genetic diversity is much more complicated because we don't know what the selection limits are. How many of you are familiar with the Illinois corn oil experiment? If not, I can suggest you to look it up. There's been an experiment done on on 2 corn lines, divergently selected for oil content that has been going on since the 1850s. And they're still selecting, they're still diverging, there's still production, they can still select, they haven't exhausted the variability, in spite all the theory would say that if you keep inbreeding things, the variability should go away. So what happened there? And if you think about it in something that hits closer to home, you have chickens, chooks for you. You have chickens, right? We're still selecting, we still haven't exhausted all the variabilities there, so what happened? Under everything I told you before, if you keep inbreeding, eventually everything will go to stop, okay? We'll stop. Here comes non-additive genetic variation once again. There's a lot of epistatic variation that we're not aware of. And actually, what we define additive dominance epistasis, it's purely a statistical definition of something that is much more complicated and it acts in a very non-linear way against each other. So, a couple of exercises here to tell you that if we look for epistasis, now that we have the data, we find a lot of epistasis, okay? And I'm not gonna give you a talk on quantitative genetics, but additive and dominance and epistasis trade off. Dominance variants get transformed in additive variants depending on the allele frequencies. So here you have this little table here that shows you that depending on the allele frequency of A1 and the allele frequency of B1, if you have epistatic effects, they are actually translated either to dominance variation or to additive variation. So it's hard, it's complicated, and what we're able to identify depends on the model that we use. So a lot of people, let me see, okay, all right, I'll stop here. So what are the future directions? So we have a lot of mature information on how to manage our population. We don't have a lot of information on how to measure our population. So as the number of information grows bigger, as the sequence information on the population becomes bigger, as the model becomes better, we should be able to actually do a better job at doing some of these things. Some of the other things will be always related to the actual structure and logistic of the population. So there is no avoiding the fact that we have one bull inseminating a lot of cows. What we can do is to try to identify better measure of how bad is the inbreeding carried by that bull for the rest of the population. And with this, if you haven't seen, there's a lot of people working with me. I just basically go around talking, but everybody else do the job. And these are the people that actually fund our research. And if there are questions or if you want to go to sleep, I'll be happy to answer.